Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the content. As a college student, I work hard to create these videos, and I edit everything on my mobile phone. I'm hoping to upgrade to a laptop to improve the quality of my videos, but I don't want to ask for money directly. This Christmas, if you enjoy what I do, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could consider subscribing to the channel. It would mean the world to me. Your support helps me so much as I continue working toward my goals. Wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. May this festive season bring you joy and warmth. Thanks again for your support, and stay tuned for more.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, a few days of peace, and a chance to clear my mind. The farm belonged to an old friend of the family, a sprawling property on the outskirts of nowhere. Fields stretched endlessly, with dense woods framing the horizon. The main house stood in quiet isolation, surrounded by creaky barns and rusting equipment that hadn't been touched in decades. The idea of solitude had seemed appealing, until I actually got there. The first night was uneventful, almost tranquil. I spent most of the evening settling in, unpacking groceries, and exploring the place. The farmhouse was a rustic relic, with wooden floors that groaned underfoot and walls adorned with faded photographs of strangers long dead. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust. By the time I climbed into bed, the silence outside was so thick it felt oppressive. No cars, no distant hum of civilization. Just crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up to the sound of tapping. A light, deliberate knock 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 on the window. My heart raced as I sat up, peering into the darkness. The bedside clock glowed 2:13 a.m. My pulse quickened, but I reasoned with myself. A tree branch, maybe. The wind. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I got up and edged toward the window, careful not to make any noise. Pulling back the curtain, I saw nothing but my own pale reflection against the night. The next day, I chalked it up to nerves. Isolation can play tricks on you, I told myself. To shake the feeling, I decided to explore the property. The fields were overgrown, the grass brushing against my knees as I walked. I found an old barn, its paint peeling and roof sagging. Inside were the remnants of a bygone era, rusted tools, broken wooden crates, and a tractor that looked like it hadn't moved in 50 years. Something about the place felt wrong, though. The air was heavy, and shadows seemed to linger in the corners longer than they should have. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, I sat on the porch with a beer, trying to enjoy the quiet. That's when I saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the field. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his features, but close enough that it was clear he was watching me. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the orange sky. "Hey!" I called out, my voice carrying into the stillness. "Can I help you?" No response. Just that unnerving, motionless figure. I stood up, my stomach nodding. By the time I reached the edge of the porch, he was gone. I scanned the field, my eyes darting from one patch of tall grass to the next, but there was no sign of him. I told myself it was a neighbor, maybe a farmhand curious about the new occupant. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That night, the tapping came again. Louder this time, more insistent. Knock knock knock. My throat went dry as I turned on the bedside lamp. The sound stopped immediately. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening. Then came the creak of floorboards, inside the house. My heart pounded as I grabbed the heavy flashlight I'd brought with me. The old farmhouse was a maze of narrow hallways and creaky stairs, every shadow feeling like a threat. I moved cautiously, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. In the living room, the front door was wide open. I knew I'd locked it before going to bed. Panic clawed at me as I stepped outside, scanning the porch and the yard beyond. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I locked the door again and shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. Sleep didn't come easily after that. By the third day, I was on edge. Every creak, Every rustle of leaves set me on high alert. I decided to check the perimeter of the property, looking for any signs of trespassers. Near the barn, I found footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy boots. They led around the back of the barn and into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The forest was dense, the canopy above blocking out most of the daylight. The trail led deeper and deeper until I came across something that made my stomach churn. A small clearing, where the ground was disturbed. Freshly dug earth. Beside it lay a shovel, its blade caked with dirt. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I'd seen enough true crime documentaries to know what a shallow grave looked like. My first instinct was to call the police, but I stopped myself. What would I even tell them? That I'd found some disturbed dirt on a farm I didn't even own. That evening, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to pack up and leave first thing in the morning. As I was loading some of my things into the car, I heard a noise behind me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the man from the field. He was closer now, his face partially hidden by the brim of a hat. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough and calloused. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, and then another. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. "Stay back!" I shouted. That's when I saw the knife in his hand, the blade catching the light. Pure, primal fear took over. I bolted for the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call for help. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the kitchen and waited. Minutes felt like hours as I listened for any sign of him. Then came the sound of glass shattering from the back of the house. He was inside. The next few moments were a blur. I remember running, hiding, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The house was a labyrinth of dark corners and narrow spaces. At one point, I found myself in a closet, the door barely cracked open. Through the gap, I saw him walk past, the knife glinting in his hand. He moved slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. Eventually, I made a break for it, dashing out the front door and into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my lungs burning and legs trembling. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and I flagged down the driver, babbling incoherently about what had happened. They called the police, who arrived shortly after. The farmhouse was searched, but the man was gone. The officers found evidence of his presence: muddy boot prints, the shattered glass, the disturbed earth in the woods, but no sign of him. They assured me they'd keep investigating, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was just another city dweller spooked by rural life. I never went back to that farm. Weeks later, I learned from the family friend who owned the property that more strange things had happened. Livestock found mutilated, tools going missing, distant figures seen lurking in the fields. The man was never caught, and his motives remain a mystery. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me, the cold, calculating menace in his eyes. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of tapping on glass. It was the smell that first drew me in, a faint, sweet rot that lingered in the air. I hadn't planned to visit the old farm. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay on the edge of town. But something about that smell, drifting through my open car window as I drove past, made me pull over. The farm was a relic from another time, its once vibrant red barn now faded to a dull rust color, shingles missing from the roof, and ivy climbing the walls like greedy fingers. The house, perched at the top of a small hill, looked just as neglected. Shattered windows, a sagging porch, and a door hanging slightly ajar. The surrounding fields were overgrown, wild grass swaying in the breeze, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had. The Wilkerson family had owned the property for generations, running a prosperous dairy farm until one day, they simply disappeared. No one knew why or where they'd gone. Theories ranged from bankruptcy to a tragic accident, but no one could agree on the truth. The place had been left to rot ever since, a monument to unanswered questions. But now, standing at the edge of the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That smell, it wasn't just rot. It was something deeper, something unnatural. I told myself I'd just take a quick look around, satisfy my curiosity, and leave. No harm in that, right? The path to the barn was overgrown, weeds snagging at my jeans as I walked. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. The barn door was partially open, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated before pushing it wider and stepping inside. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the holes in the roof. Dust motes danced in the beams, and the air was thick and musty. Old equipment lay scattered around, rusted milk cans, broken pitchforks, and a tractor that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. But what caught my attention was the pile of burlap sacks in the corner. Flies buzzed around them, landing and taking off in a frenzy. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The smell was overwhelming now, and as I got closer, I realized why. The sacks were filled with something rotting. My stomach turned as I reached out and peeled back the edge of one. Inside were bones. Animal bones, I told myself, though I wasn't entirely convinced. They were too clean, too precise, as if they'd been stripped of flesh intentionally. A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around. The barn door had swung shut. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement. The barn was silent except for the distant creak of wood settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I backed out of the barn, my hands trembling. Outside, the air felt fresher, but the unease lingered. I glanced up at the house on the hill. Something compelled me to go there, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. Maybe it was the curiosity, the need to know what had happened to the Wilkersons. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't explain. The front porch groaned under my weight as I climbed the steps. The door, hanging open, revealed a dark interior. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The smell here was different, less rot, more mildew and dust. The living room was a time capsule, frozen in the 1970s. Faded floral wallpaper, a brown shag carpet, and a rotary phone sitting on a small side table. A family portrait hung crookedly on the wall, the faces smiling but somehow off, like they knew a secret they weren't sharing. I moved deeper into the house, the silence pressing in on me. The kitchen was cluttered with dishes, as if the family had just finished a meal before vanishing. The calendar on the wall was stuck on June 1978. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the date circled in red was today's date, June 12th. A loud thud upstairs made me jump. I froze, straining to hear. Another thud, followed by the sound of something being dragged. Against my better judgment, I crept up the staircase, each step a groaning protest. The hallway at the top was dark, the only light coming from a partially open door at the end. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping. I pushed the door open with trembling hands and stepped inside. The room was empty, except for a chair in the center. On it sat a tape recorder, its reels spinning. The tapping sound was coming from the machine, the end of the tape slapping against the spool. I reached out and stopped it, then pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. Then came a voice, low and distorted. "You shouldn't be here." The tape ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. My blood ran cold as I realized the dragging sound hadn't stopped. It was coming from the hallway. I turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. I ran. Down the stairs, out the door, and into the field. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I glanced over my shoulder. The figure stood at the edge of the porch, watching me. As I sped away, I caught one last glimpse of the farm in my rearview mirror. The house, the barn, the overgrown fields. It looked the same as it always had, but I knew better. I never went back, but the smell stayed with me. Sweet, rotting, unnatural. Sometimes I catch a whiff of it when I least expect it, and I wonder if the farm is calling me back. If it's waiting. And I wonder if, one day, I'll have no choice but to answer. The day began with the sun casting a golden hue over the sprawling fields, a picturesque scene that belied the horrors waiting to unfold. I had no intention of visiting the Caldwell farm that morning, but fate seemed to have other plans. I was a reporter for a small local newspaper, always on the hunt for stories that might elevate my career beyond mundane town hall meetings and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The Caldwell farm had recently become the talk of the town, and not in a good way. For decades, the Caldwells had been known for their successful wheat farm, a place that provided not only food but also jobs for the community. Then, about a year ago, the farm was abruptly sold to a man named Victor Harlow. No one knew much about him, except that he had paid in cash and preferred to keep to himself. The locals whispered that something was wrong with the place ever since the ownership changed. Livestock would disappear from neighboring farms, strange lights were seen at night, and an eerie silence seemed to blanket the area. That morning, I received a tip from a farmer who lived near the Caldwell property. He claimed to have seen someone digging in the fields under the cover of darkness. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. Armed with a camera, a notepad, and a growing sense of unease, I drove out to the farm. The long dirt road leading to the property was flanked by overgrown hedges and fields that looked neglected. When I arrived, the sight of the dilapidated farmhouse and the barn, leaning precariously to one side, only deepened my unease. The place felt abandoned, but the stories of nocturnal activity suggested otherwise. I parked my car a safe distance away and approached on foot. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't just manure or decaying vegetation. It was sharper, more acidic, and utterly nauseating. I followed the scent to a patch of freshly turned soil near the edge of the field. My heart raced as I spotted a shovel half buried in the dirt. There was something unnatural about the ground, as if it were hiding a secret. I hesitated but eventually started digging, my fingers trembling with each scoop of soil I unearthed. It didn't take long to find something. A burlap sack, stained dark and reeking of decay. I didn't want to open it, but my instincts told me I had to. With shaking hands, I peeled back the edges. Inside were bones. They were too small to be human, but they weren't animal either, at least, not any animal I could recognize. The cuts on the bones were clean, almost surgical, as if someone had taken great care in dismembering whatever this was. A noise behind me made me freeze. I spun around, expecting to see another curious animal, or maybe the farmer who had tipped me off. Instead, I saw a figure in the distance, near the barn. They were standing completely still, watching me. Even from far away, I could feel the intensity of their gaze. I quickly reburied the sack and retreated to a cluster of trees, using the cover to move closer to the barn. The figure had disappeared by the time I reached the building. The barn door creaked open with a gust of wind, revealing a dark interior. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, but it was enough to reveal tools hanging from the walls and piles of hay scattered across the floor. There was also something else, an array of jars lined up on a wooden table. Each jar contained something unrecognizable, suspended in a murky liquid. Organs? Samples? I couldn't tell, but my stomach churned at the sight. I heard footsteps behind me and whipped around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. Victor Harlow stood there, his face partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I'm just a reporter," I stammered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I got a tip about some unusual activity on your property. I'm just looking into it." "You've seen too much," he replied, taking a step closer. In his hand, he held a long, rusted blade that looked like it had been pulled from the pages of a history book. Panic set in, and I bolted past him, knocking over a stack of crates in the process. The barn door slammed shut behind me as I ran towards the farmhouse, hoping to find some kind of shelter or a phone to call for help. The farmhouse door was unlocked, swinging open with a loud creak as I burst inside. The interior was worse than I had imagined. The walls were covered in yellowing newspaper clippings, each one detailing mysterious disappearances and unsolved murders. Some of the clippings had photos, and I recognized one of the faces, a local veterinarian who had gone missing months ago. The sound of heavy boots on the porch sent me into a frenzy. I darted into the kitchen, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a cast iron skillet, and I grabbed it just as the front door slammed open. Victor's silhouette filled the doorway, his blade glinting in the dim light. "You should have stayed away," he growled, advancing toward me. I swung the skillet with all my might, connecting with his arm. He let out a grunt of pain but didn't drop the blade. I ran past him, back into the hallway, and up the stairs. My only thought was to find a place to hide. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, most of them locked. I found one that opened into a bedroom and slammed the door behind me, shoving a dresser in front of it for good measure. My breathing was ragged as I scanned the room for an escape route. The window was my only option. I opened it and looked down, estimating the drop. It wasn't far, but it would still hurt. Before I could make my decision, the door burst open, sending the dresser toppling over. Victor stood in the doorway, his eyes wild. "There's no way out," he said, stepping closer. In a desperate move, I hurled a lamp at him, then climbed out the window, letting myself drop to the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle as I landed, but adrenaline kept me moving. I limped toward the fields, hoping the tall grass would provide enough cover. Victor didn't follow immediately. Instead, I heard him shouting something, his voice echoing across the property. It wasn't until I glanced back that I realized why. Two large dogs emerged from the shadows of the barn, their eyes glowing eerily in the moonlight. They charged toward me, snarling and snapping. I ran as fast as I could, my injured ankle slowing me down. The dogs were gaining on me, their growls growing louder. Just as I thought they would reach me, a shot rang out, followed by another. The dogs yelped and collapsed mid-stride. I turned to see the farmer who had tipped me off, standing with a shotgun in hand. "Get in the truck!" he shouted. I didn't hesitate. We sped away from the farm, my heart pounding as I watched the property disappear in the rearview mirror. Victor stood at the edge of the field, watching us with a look that promised this wasn't over. The authorities were called, and an investigation ensued. They found the jars in the barn, the newspaper clippings in the house, and the freshly dug graves in the field. Victor Harlow was arrested, though he refused to speak a word during his interrogation. The true extent of his crimes remains unknown, but the Caldwell farm has been sealed off indefinitely. I've since moved away, leaving the town and its dark history behind. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the farm. Of the jars, the bones, and Victor's unrelenting gaze. And I wake up wondering if he's still out there, waiting for the chance to finish what he started.